welcome back to yet another video on the Canon M50. My name is Klaus Fransen, and today I'm gonna challenge this obsession with always shooting at ISO 100, which is usually deemed to be the cleanest and most optimal setting for your camera, both in terms of photography and videography. But after this video, I'm sure you will realize that ISO and high ISO is your friend, even on a small entry-level mirrorless camera like the Canon M50. So, to prove this point, I made a few different tests where I'm trying to correct the underexposure using DaVinci Resolve instead of simply raising the ISO. Then for the next test, I'm gonna compare fixing the exposure with ISO versus fix it in post. Then we're gonna take a look at what denoise software can do and resharpening, and whether or not you can save a high ISO clip or you can save a underexposed clip brought back post. Then we're just gonna take a look at the color, because when you increase ISO, it is true that you're going to increase the amount of noise in your footage, and you may introduce some color artifacts, some color shifting, and typically we want to avoid that. But again, after this video, I'm sure you're not going to be afraid of shooting at ISO 6400 on your Canon M50. And I did the testing on the Canon M50 inside this small studio here, and the results are based on that. So this is more like an indication, a proof of concept. It may not be able to be translated into every single camera, but at the end of the day, increasing the ISO will always be better than shooting underexposed and trying to fix it in post. So for test number one, I'm gonna increase the aperture by 1 stop at a time, and on the left side you'll see the straight out the camera, the no correction image, and then to your right you will see the version with corrections on it. To begin with, we're gonna have an identical image because we are starting at EV0 at f2.0. I'm gonna increase to 2.8, and if I pause here, you can notice that you might have noticed that there's a waveform in the middle of the screen, and that is simply to give you the mathematical tool to compare the two images here. If you're watching on a phone, I suggest you rewatch this on a computer because it may be too small to notice the difference. Anyways, I'm using a whiteboard so that I can make it as standardized as possible, even though this is hard to completely 100% standardize. But that is not the goal with this test. The goal is to prove that ISO 100 is not always the best decision. So now I'm just gonna let it roll, and I will ask you to notice on the right side when you think that my skin starts to look terrible, when you will notice noise, and look at the left side more like a, oh, this is actually really dark, because we're going all the way down to -7 stops of underexposure. So it's gonna get completely dark. So remember, this is like crazy scenarios. You would probably never shoot this much underexposed. But yeah, pay attention to the EV value as it drops, and pay attention to my skin and to the noise level. So yeah, at -5 we're basically at a black screen on the M50. Autofocus is starting to struggle. -6 is terrible, but remember we are recovering something that is more or less completely black. So to sum up my point of view, -1 is perfectly fine to recover. -2, it's not too bad. You could probably give it some more love in post and make it look pleasing. At the moment you reach -3 EV, in other words, 3 stops of underexposure, I don't think it's worth. I don't think you can save it to a point where you can bring it back to a -1 or a perfect exposure. It's not possible. If you look at the highlight roll-off on my skin and my skin tone in general, I start to look green and sick, and the colors get smushy and muddy. So I told this before in another video on exposure, and you should really not go under 2 on the Canon M50. -2 in exposure value is the limit. And I don't care if you're shooting in a flat profile, it will not be able to recover it to the same degree as shooting correct in the first place. So you can't fix everything in post, but you may have been able to fix it with ISO, because now we've been really stubborn and thinking, oh, I gotta shoot up ISO 100, or it's gonna look like trash. Truth is, it's gonna look like trash if you shoot out ISO 100 instead of bumping it up, because you gotta stay below the limit. Usually I would say 1600 is my ISO limit on the Canon M50. But with a bit of massaging on the footage and a bit of night reduction, you can actually get away with way more. Now, we're gonna move on to test number 2. And now you're gonna see how the ISO is affecting the footage. So the reason we don't like ISO is because it's gonna introduce grains and noise and artifacts, and it's gonna make everything look soft. And all of that is true. And like I said, anything above 1600, I start noticing loss in sharpness and a bit of noise. And if you go beyond that, it's gonna increase more and more. But my personal opinion or view on ISO have changed completely after this test. So for test number 2, we're gonna do the same thing again. We're gonna increase our aperture, stopping down the aperture by 1 stop, but we're also gonna increase the ISO by 1 stop, meaning we're gonna stay at EV0. That's gonna be on your left side, and on the right side we're gonna see the fixed in post version. So I want you to pay attention to the ISO as it increases. When you think that, oh, now it's getting too soft for my taste, now I start to notice the grain, and then quickly look over to your right and look at how terrible it is to shoot underexposed and fix it in post. So yeah, as always, there's going to be a waveform monitor here in the middle. First shot is identical, exactly the same clip, no corrections done. Now we're at ISO 200. Image looks fine. -2 still looks fine. ISO 400 still looks fine. -3 EV, and I'm out of here. This looks terrible. ISO 800 still going strong. ISO 1600 still decent. Now 3200, I notice my skin's getting soft. I'm losing details in my hair and my beard. 6400, very soft, a bit flickery. And now we're seeing a lot of noise at the maximum ISO of 12,800. But just look at the difference between underexposing and just bumping that ISO way up there. I mean, it is night and day difference. And I would choose to shoot ISO 12,800 any day of the week if my alternative was shooting 5 stops, 3 stops underexposed. I mean, ISO 12,800 pretty much looks better than ISO 100 3 stops underexposed. So to sum up, like I said before, ISO 1600 is usually my go-to limit, something I try to stay below. And the way you can try to stay below that is either increasing the artificial light coming in or increase the natural light coming in, use some bouncing cards, whatever you got, add more light to your scene. You could also open your aperture up, bring in more light, or lower your shutter speed. Now, that is not always possible when shooting video. And I know I shot at 1/30 in this test, but that was only because I wanted to get as close as possible perfect exposure with the light I got and the settings that happened to be at 1/30, but because I was not moving too much, I think it was fine. Okay, so ISO is super complicated, so don't feel bad if you don't understand how it works exactly, but to put it simple, ISO is boosting the signal. So when light hits the sensor, it's gonna be read as a value of, let's say, 2. If you double your ISO, that value is gonna be read as 4. So this goes for every kind of signal, including the noise floor. So when your camera is recording, there will be noise, no matter what ISO. As you increase that ISO, the noise is also gonna get increased. But increasing that noise floor in camera is way better than doing it on a computer. So my personal view is up to ISO 1600, the image is still very much usable. Anything higher than that is gonna be soft, and you're gonna be noticeably softer. However, when you compare it to the alternative of shooting underexposed, I mean, there is no real discussion there. Alright, so let's move on to test number 3. And we're gonna take advantage of technology now. We're gonna take advantage of having a denoising software in DaVinci Resolve Studio. This is also true if you got Neat Video or whatever it's called, or any other kind of denoising software. Having this tool is something you can take advantage of. It is rather CPU and GPU demanding, and that is why you're gonna see that some of this video is gonna stutter in the vector scope, because I had to record it through OBS while playing back in DaVinci, but it's fine, it's fine. So on the left is gonna be the high ISO versus the underexposed with ISO 100. And you can see when I'm gonna add the denoising and when I'm gonna add the sharpening down below the image. And I suggest you consider watching this a few times, making up your own mind when you think it's gonna look too bad. But in my opinion, ISO 6400 with sharpening and denoise is still usable. ISO 12800 though is too much. It is too soft to be something that I would be proud of delivering. If I were in a pinch with no lighting available, sure, I would do it, but I would try to make ISO 6400 work before doing that. I mean, in this scenario, I am shooting at f16 and f22 at the end, so that is with the aperture is like super tight. And another thing is also that we're going to see softer images once we get past f11 on most lenses. Anyway, I think that this pretty much proves that shooting at ISO 100 is not always the best thing to do. You could do like a bit of both, underexposed a little bit just to keep the ISO a little bit lower, but at the end of the day, I think it's better to shoot a little bit overexposed with a bit of a higher ISO and then bringing that back at the end than risking shooting too dark. So to sum up, before I said ISO 1600 was my limit. Now with a bit of sharpening and a bit of denoising, I think 3200 is very usable. Even ISO 6400 is usable, but you will see some degradation to the sharpness and the highlight roll-off and all these sort of things, but the alternative is way worse. So there's no discussion. Yeah, and overall, shooting 2 stops underexposed can be usable, but anything below that is, yeah, you can't save that even with denoising or resharpening in post. That's just going to be too much noise. And this is for the Canon M50. Other cameras will have different dynamic ranges, and the picture profile or log profile and all these kind of things is going to have an effect on this. Even ISO is actually changing the dynamic range, so that's a whole other discussion, and we're not going to take that into account here. Okay, so this brings us on to test number 4, and this is going to be quick, because another issue of shooting high ISO is the introduction to color noise, color smearing, or color artifacts, and color shifting. I didn't find any real color shifting issues with Canon M50. I tried to stack the vector scope on top of each other. What I did see is color noise, and you will also notice this in this test. So the way you're gonna see noise in the colors is gonna be on the vector scope. On these little dots and line in the bottoms, it's gonna shake. But before I'm gonna prove this, just pay attention to the image quality and tell me when you start noticing problems with the colors. Me personally, around 3200, I think I start to see some of the color escaping into the black lines between in the color spectra. Let me just roll this back. So on your left you have the one with no denoise, and on your right you have with denoise. And to me, I start noticing some color noise in this color checkerboard around ISO 1600 and above. But it's very much correctable with a bit of denoising. Okay, so I know if you're watching this on a phone or a small screen, it's really hard to actually look at the vector scope. So I decided to make them bigger. So on your left, it's going to be a vector scope with no denoising, and on your right, a vector scope with denoising. And I want you to notice or pay attention to the shaking or the spreading out of the lines and how much these small dots is going to move around. And then once you start noticing on the left side, oh, something is dancing all around, take a glance to the right and see how much the denoising software is actually doing, how great it is at keeping them steady. Right? So I'm gonna play this. ISO 100 looks good. ISO 200 looks good. No real movement to the left. Still good at 400. 800. We start to see some dancing, but it's fine. It's not too bad. 1600. Oh, they're getting jittery. And at 3200, I mean, it's getting bad. And it's only gonna get worse. At 6400, they are dancing quite a bit, but it is really stable with the denoising. So denoising can definitely help you shoot at a higher ISO without getting a real punishment in the image quality. There is a limit because denoising is also gonna smooth out the skin and the details, but it's a fair trade-off if you're in a situation with low light and you have to use a higher ISO. Now, the last example here is simply a graded shot of ISO 3200 on the left with no corrections, but with denoise and sharpening, and then on the right with a bit more contrast. As you can see, it is holding together way better than it did in the earlier testing we did. So that's where I'm gonna leave it. I know it's been a long time since the last video here on the channel, and I've been busy, and this video here has been harder and more technical and difficult to put together, and I had to think, how can I present the results in the best manner? and this was what I came up with. And it's not perfect, but I thought, well, better done than perfect, so here it is. As you may have noticed, I also removed this professional black cover I had behind to hide all this mess behind me. But I got annoyed by it because I have to live in this room as well, and it was taking up way too much space. I hope you learned something. I hope you feel more confident in shooting ISO above 100, and we can stop telling ourselves this lie about, I have to shoot at a low ISO. You don't have to. You should increase the ISO before you think to yourself, I can fix this in post. Now, this was a video test, and shooting RAW on the Canon M50 will allow you to shoot underexposed to a way higher degree than you can in video. So bear that in mind. This was a video test, and it is not applicable to photography, except for the noise introduction in post is still going to be greater if you fix it in post than adding higher ISO while taking the picture. That thing is true, but the underexposing and how much you can bring back is not true for photography. Yep, that's it. Hope you're all doing well, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.